Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to spend the afternoon here with you for another Inflation Reduction Act implementation webinar. I was just voting on the Senate floor right above us. I apologize, they called the roll call, so a little delay. But today we're going to learn about how the brand new option for tax-exempt entities to receive tax credits as cash, also known as direct pay option, will unlock affordable clean energy for cities, towns, schools, nonprofits, and more. So a special thank you to our friends at the Treasury Department for joining us today. You see David up there, who will talk through the latest and final direct pay guidance that was just released yesterday. You're getting it first. So I'm proud of the service and the assistance that we have been able to provide to towns and municipalities and local organizations through these virtual Inflation Reduction Act implementation webinars and through my monthly office hours. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that communities in the Commonwealth receive more than their fair share of historic federal clean energy and climate funding. We're the brain state. You're here to get the information so you can act fast. And I know your local needs are significant as you walk a tightrope to balance budgets with limited revenues, rising costs, so many important priorities. I know that our municipal leaders, our school teachers, grassroots organizers are the engine that propels the Commonwealth forward. We are here to help realize the visions of each and every community. And we know that takes money because a vision without funding is an hallucination. So now the funding is arriving. And I'm proud to have worked to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate and clean energy investment in our nation's history. And with this investment, we have a chance to turn your clean energy dreams into a safe, healthy, and affordable reality. We passed the new uncapped tax incentives to purchase new electric vehicles, build charging station infrastructure, install heat pumps, set up solar and energy storage systems in schools and public buildings. Critically, these uncapped tax credits have newly uncapped potential. And thanks to the direct pay option, that means that tax-exempt entities, which wouldn't have had a tax burden that gets offset by credits, can just claim the credits as cash. No longer do our schools, towns, nonprofits have to get a fraction of the benefit of tax credits. No longer do our municipalities have to watch as private companies get clean infrastructure while the public good gets left behind. We'll put solar panels on the town library, on minority churches in town to generate clean electricity to read by. We'll make the fire station energy efficient and comfortable for our first responders. We'll turn the town hall into the town hub for electric vehicle charging. We'll transform your sustainability goals into community victories. The Inflation Reduction Act was stocked with even more opportunities to build clean futures in every one of Massachusetts' 351 cities and towns. With these resources, we won't just survive the climate crisis, we're going to build communities that thrive in a safe and a healthy future. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleagues from the Treasury Department, who will provide important guidance on how to take advantage of the opportunities made available to municipalities and other local communities through the Inflation Reduction Act, including the direct pay option for clean energy tax credits. This guidance was just finalized yesterday, so you're getting this news hot off the press as we fight to stay cool from climate change. So thank you so much. And David, thank you for spending your first day after issuing these new guidance, with us. And we thank you. And please, whenever you feel comfortable, begin.
Great. Senator, thanks so very much. I really appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity. As you said, timing is everything. And this is one of the very first presentations we're having the opportunity to make after the rules were finalized and issued yesterday. I'm going to see if I could start to share my screen so that we could make this presentation. I will tell folks that Well, seems not to be coming up. I know that there are folks on your staff who may have the presentation as well. I may ask them to share it if they can. I'll start by saying as we begin all of these presentations, we have to provide a few quick ground rules. So what I'm going to be doing today is covering certain provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. But none of this presentation is itself tax guidance, and I, of course, cannot provide folks with tax advice. I want to start by putting some of what direct pay is in the context of other federal assistance. So as I think everybody on the call knows, the Biden-Harris administration, along with leaders like Senator Markey and the Congress, have worked to pass a series of laws to provide resources to local government, both to help to recover from the pandemic and to invest in economic growth. Some of that funding comes through competitive grant programs. Some of that funding comes through formula funding to states, which then gets allocated down to local government. And of course, the most popular form of funding for local government are formula dollars, no competition required, that go directly to local government, and where local government has a significant say over how those dollars are spent. Where does direct pay fall in all of that? You could advance 2 slides, by the way, if I could ask you to do that. Whoever's controlling the screen, great. So direct pay provides the resources for investment in the clean energy transition to local governments and, as the Senator said, other applicable entities. It doesn't require competition. So this is different for most local governments because we're not talking about competitions and notices of funding opportunity. We're talking about tax credits. It allows for sustainable funding in support of the clean energy transition. It's largely uncapped. There are some minor exceptions in specific programs, and it provides significant discretion to local government leaders to determine when and how to use these resources. Again, instead of appropriations for grant programs, direct pay provides funding under the tax code through tax credits. And I know, and I should say, I've spent 30 years working in and with folks in local government. I was a former city finance officer, and I know that when people would come to me and say, we want to talk to you about a tax credit, I'd say, well, wait, my city government doesn't pay taxes. I don't understand. But this is really a continuation of a number of different cases where we've been able to use the tax code in order to direct resources to priorities of the federal government. So most folks know that the earned income tax credit, for example, is a part of the tax code provision. The earned income tax credit may be one of the most significant ways to lift families out of poverty. Lots of folks in local government are familiar with the low-income housing tax credit and how that's used to fund affordable housing. All of us, right, all of us are aware of the role of tax-exempt financing in order to build infrastructure at the local level. 100-plus-year-old provision of the tax code that's a means of providing benefits to local government. Direct pay is another example of using the tax code to finance and incentivize investment in a critical policy priority, in this case, the transition to clean energy. As the Senator said, this is the largest investment in clean energy in U.S. history. The reason that I'm here talking about this from the Treasury Department is because the Treasury Department is the federal agency responsible for administering the tax code. And we've been playing a central role in implementing the clean energy tax incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, both through the issuance of rules and guidance and FAQs, such as the final rules that were issued yesterday, as well as this sort of outreach and engagement that we've been trying to do with all of the different applicable entities under direct pay. As the Senator said, what we're really doing with direct pay is opening up opportunities and incentivizing action under the tax code for local governments, for nonprofits, in much the same way that we've done for the private sector. So we already know that the Inflation Reduction Act is having a dramatic impact on private sector investment in clean energy. There are about 20 different provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act touching on the tax code. And we know that as of mid-November 2023, private companies have announced commitments to invest $142 billion in electric vehicles and battery manufacturing, $71 billion in clean energy manufacturing, and $133 billion in clean energy projects. Direct pay makes many of the same tax credits that are available to the private sector for clean energy transition available for the first time to a host of organizations that don't pay taxes. You go to the next slide. So how does this, what is elective pay? How does it work? Well, as senators started to describe, basically it means that if you are an applicable entity, we'll explain what that is in a second, and you meet the underlying requirements of the tax credit provisions that direct pay applies to, you then file a return, even though you don't have taxes to pay. And you also have to file a pre-filing registration before that, and you get the money. You get the payment back from the IRS. You go to the next slide. Okay, so what are these different applicable entities? Well, again, the senator said it, right? It can be places of worship. It includes most public or nonprofit hospitals. It includes school districts. It includes the state government. It certainly includes local government, and it includes all of the different agencies and instrumentalities of local government as well. Now, of the 20 or so tax credits, tax provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a dozen of those tax credits where direct pay applies. You go to the next slide. And those primarily are tax credits that really fall into 4 different categories. So the first is with respect to energy generation and carbon capture. And there are a series of tax credits related to that again, through direct pay are available to these non-tax paying organizations like local government. You go to the next slide. There's some tax credits related to manufacturing where direct pay applies. There's some credits related to vehicles and some credits related to fuel. Now, I would encourage everyone, all of the different organizations represented on the call, to look across all of these different tax credit provisions. I will tell you that based on the local governments that I've spoken with about the Inflation Reduction Act, the most relevant tax credits are the provision for an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for clean energy, the provision for purchase of clean vehicles under the commercial clean vehicle tax credit, and the provision for alternative fuel vehicle refueling property. Well, you go to the next slide. What types of projects are we talking about when we're talking about direct pay or elective pay? Well, I know from my experience in local governments own a lot of buildings, right? We own a lot of property, and it costs a lot of money to power and cool and heat those different buildings. The way that we power and heat and cool those buildings also has a tremendous effect on climate, has a tremendous effect on the local environment. We also know that local governments have a lot of vehicles, right? Every local government, almost no matter the size, has some sort of a fleet. And again, the operation, the cost of acquisition, the operation of that fleet, how the fleet's fueled, that all has a cost impact. It also has an environmental impact. It also has an impact on the climate. Direct pay is a way to fund a transition to clean energy for your buildings and your fleet. And I think everybody recognizes that transition is going on. Actually, an institute based out of Boston University did a survey about 2 years ago of mayors nationally. And they came back and said, about 74% of mayors around the country recognize the need for a transition of the government fleet. So what this means is that anytime a local government or another applicable entity is considering the future of its building assets or fleet assets, it should be looking to funding opportunities under direct pay. Now, some governments have looked well beyond their own facilities and their own fleet as part of the transition to clean energy. For example, a lot of local governments and I think virtually all state governments have been looking at the EPA Solar for All program. It's a grant program, but they've been looking at it in the context of providing low-cost power to underserved communities. That's another thing that local governments can be doing with the IRA tax credits and under direct pay. Different local governments, different organizations are going to pursue different priorities, and that's fine, because what works and when is really up to the individual local government. In other words, the starting point really should be your climate action plan, or your town's capital improvement plan, or your school district's sustainability plan. But when you look at those plans and you compare them to what the credits can do under direct pay, I think that what you're going to see is that direct pay becomes this incredibly powerful financial tool to accomplish your priorities. And that in many cases, these are projects that may have been on the drawing board for years as your finance director was trying to figure out how to find the funding. As the senator was saying, I love the line about what a vision without funding is, but they were looking to find the funding to make these things happen. Well, now with direct pay, that funding is available. And that's because depending on the type of project, depending on the structure of the financing, depending on where you're going to put the project within your community, and whether the project, the construction of the project meets certain requirements related to providing good jobs, the tax credits under direct pay could fund a significant portion of the cost of a project. You go to the next slide. What really drives this, and I'll talk about an example or two in a second, what really drives the value of some of these tax credit provisions are the bonus provisions that exist. So you'll see here listed, there are bonus provisions related to requirements around prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. That's what I meant when I was talking about those good jobs requirements. There are bonus provisions related to domestic content. There are bonus provisions related to projects that are in communities that qualify as energy communities. And finally, and this is a bonus provision that requires an allocation and an application, but there are bonus provisions related to projects in low income communities. Well, how do all these bonuses play out? You go to the next slide. Well, let's talk about some simple things first. Let's talk about clean vehicles. That's what Senator Markey was talking about earlier. So everybody has a fleet, right? Well, if you're buying a sedan and you're buying a clean vehicle, let's say for a building inspector who's out looking and issuing permits in your community, you could get up to $7,500 of the cost of that light vehicle, that sedan that you're purchasing directly from the federal government. In the case of a larger vehicle that meets the requirements under the Commercial Clean Vehicle Credit, that goes up to $40,000. So I was out, and I know that talked to a bunch of folks in Massachusetts. I know that you've got a number of these in Massachusetts as well, but I was out in Arizona in Phoenix with a school district out there a couple of weeks ago they were showing off their electric school bus. Well, if you're buying an electric school bus today and you apply under direct pay and you meet the requirements of the clean vehicle credit, you get up to $40,000 for that. Under the alternative fuel property credit, you get up to a 30% credit on investment in eligible EV charging. But let's talk about that investment tax credit. Let's talk about how that works out. And that's really where the bonuses come into play. Hypothetically, let's talk about a solar farm. Let's talk about a 2 megawatt solar farm. And just so I don't have to do complicated math in my head, let's say it's $2 million for that 2 megawatt solar farm. Well, you start off with making sure that that the investment tax credit is applicable, and you start with getting a tax credit of 6% of that investment cost. That's about $120,000. That's good. I was a local government finance officer. I would never turn down $120,000 from the federal government. But if you are able to meet, and you do meet the requirements around prevailing wage and registered apprenticeships, that 6% goes to 30%. If you meet the domestic content bonus requirements, that goes to 40%. And if you meet the requirements in terms of placing the project in an energy community, all of a sudden you're up to 50% of the cost being covered through direct pay. That's $1 million. Right? If you looked at that project before direct pay and it didn't pencil out, all of a sudden that project starts to pencil out. We go to the next slide. So another great thing around direct pay is we've all heard over the last couple of years, particularly with the passage of the rescue plan and with the bipartisan infrastructure law, this whole notion of blending and braiding of different sources. Well, you could do that with direct pay. You could use elective pay in conjunction with grants and loans. And those grants and loans are still included as part of the basis for the project. So you could both blend and braid, and you're not punished for the use of grants and loans in a project. We go to the next slide. And there are a couple of examples that are detailed in the final guidance that was issued yesterday about exactly how that works, both in the case of grant for a school bus and also a grant for a project with a solar farm at a higher education institution. Go to the next slide. Right. The other thing that's great about direct pay, and again, I say this as a former local government finance official, one of the most frustrating things is when you know that certain investments that you could make in capital can produce recurring savings as a result, but you can't find the dollars for the upfront capital. Well, we know from some of the studies cited here that things like municipal fleet electrification, things like putting in solar power, things like central geothermal heating, we know that those all have the potential to produce recurring savings. Well, direct pay becomes a vehicle for providing some of that upfront capital that allows you to then reap the benefit of the recurring operating savings. You go to the next slide. Great. So let me talk a little bit in the remaining time and leaving some time for questions. Let me talk about how this all works, right? So first step, you identify and pursue the qualifying project or activity. What does that mean? That means what I had said earlier, going back to your capital plan, your sustainability plan, your climate action plan, and identifying the project and then seeing which tax credits it may be eligible for. Second thing is you actually have to put the project into service, right? So there is an issue and folks should be aware of it and think it through. There's a need for upfront financing before you get direct pay at the back end. you need to determine your tax year, right? Because that's going to determine how and when you make the filing. Then, as I mentioned before, there is a pre-filing registration that's required before you actually file the return. Then you file the return and you receive the payment after the return is processed. You could go to the next slide. So for folks who were able to put projects into service last year, and we talked more about how we're looking at taxable year now, because that was one of the major changes that was part of the final rules issued yesterday. But if you're ready to pre-file, there's information, detailed information on the IRS website of how to do it. There's both a user guide and a video that walks you through the pre-filing registration process. Go to the next slide. So let's talk about tax year. One of the issues that a number of local governments raised while the preliminary guidance for direct pay was out there was what some people called the hangover year problem, what some people called the hangover year problem, what other people called the donut hole problem. And the issue was whether or not, because taxable years are normally aligned with fiscal years, whether or not there was a way for a project that may have gone into service in the first part of 2023, but was going into service in a 2022-2023 fiscal year, whether or not there was still a way to get direct pay for that. And the answer, based on the final rule that was issued yesterday, is yes. If you've never declared a tax year before, right, and that's going to be the case for most local governments. If you've never declared a tax year before, you will be allowed to declare a calendar year as a fiscal year for the purpose of getting direct pay. That is a huge benefit for early adopters around the Inflation Reduction Act and the provisions of direct pay. You go to the next slide. And this slide just briefly lays out how the process works in terms of the timing of when you would file the tax returns. You go to the next slide. The other major change that came out in the rules yesterday, and this is actually not a change to the direct pay rule, but a new proposed rule, is a new proposed rule that would give additional flexibility around co-ownership of electricity producing applicable credit property. I think a number of local governments and a number of state governments in particular asked for additional flexibility, wanted to do projects. So there is now a new proposed rule in this area where we're now in a public comment period. We go to the next slide, and I think we're coming to the finish pretty close to time. We go to the next one. Great. I wanted to close with one piece in terms of how local governments might want to be thinking about the opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act that go beyond direct pay, right? So the first bullet here really speaks to what I've been talking about for the last half hour or so, which are projects where local governments or other applicable entities are directly investing in certain clean energy projects, certain efforts around clean energy transition. But there are other things that local governments can be thinking about as well. So first of all, because of some of those place-based bonus provisions, those bonuses can also affect decisions about different projects around community and economic development in your city and your town, that again, those bonuses may add up so that projects that didn't necessarily pencil out before, whether it's housing, whether it's other types of economic development, now they do. So a number of cities, a number of towns are starting to think about the IRA tax credits, not just from the perspective of, gee, how as a city or a town can I use direct pay to fund some of my projects, but what could I be thinking about differently in terms of housing or economic development strategy that makes use of the tax credits? And then the last thing is there are huge number of tax credits and benefits and incentives available under the Inflation Reduction Act to individual consumers, to individual businesses to aid in the transition to clean energy. Just as a lot of local governments have worked over the years to help promote things like EITC, which I referenced earlier, to their residents, we really hope that local governments work with Treasury as we seek to promote to consumers and to businesses as well the tax credits that are available to them. Go to the next one. So there are a lot of resources available on the IRS website. There are resources available on the cleanenergy.gov website. There are, particularly for local governments, there's an e-news subscription available for the IRS. The White House has put out a rather comprehensive guidebook to the Inflation Reduction Act as well. And I'll just close by saying, and I think I said this earlier in the presentation, at Treasury, we really welcome the opportunity to have conversations with local governments to understand how they are putting direct pay to use, to think through strategy questions. Again, not tax advice questions, but strategy questions. We really want to make sure that every local government, every applicable entity can take full advantage of the provisions of direct pay. Let me stop there.
David, thank you. That was incredible. And I think everyone out there right now is got their little calculator out, figuring out how many little categories of qualification that they might, So can I just ask a question? First, I want to thank you. Here's my quick question. I was out in Worcester yesterday. The federal government just, $6 million for 15 new all-electric buses. The buses came up from Connecticut. So if Worcester going forward wants more electric buses, the buses were made in Connecticut. So you get extra bonus points for that, right?
On the electric vehicles, yes, I believe you do.
And the buses were made with prevailing wages, a union, to get bonus for that.
That's the whole idea behind this, Senator. As you all know, the bonuses are really geared to make sure that the economic impact is part of what we're doing with this, right? It's obviously
exactly.
to transition.
And the city of Worcester is thinking about putting up solar right there at the site for charging. So they would get bonus for that as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so it makes the next round of all electric buses, not from grants from the federal government, more affordable for the city, because they can see that actually now it's getting competitive with diesel vehicles that they would purchase otherwise, except the electricity is lower, the repair costs are lower. You have all of these additional, benefits. So yeah, I'm getting so excited about as much as anyone can get excited about tax policy, but you did a good job of getting us all going. So thank you, David, and thanks everyone else for joining us.